Osama Bin Laden is one of the most well-known names in modern history, yet few people understand the full story of his life. For most people in the West, the name is linked directly to the September 11, 2001 attacks, when hijacked airplanes were used to destroy the Twin Towers in New York City and strike the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people. For those who remember that day, the name Osama Bin Laden became a symbol of terror and violence, the face of the enemy in what came to be called the War on Terror. In some parts of the Muslim world, however, Osama bin Laden's name has been understood differently. To some, especially a small minority of his supporters, he was described as a fighter who stood against the most powerful nation on earth, a man who spoke about issues such as the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia and the suffering of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. To many other Muslims, though, he was neither hero nor defender, but a reckless extremist who brought war, instability and destruction upon Muslims themselves. And for neutral historians, Osama bin Laden is not viewed simply as a villain or a martyr, but as a product of his environment, his family, and the global events of the 20th century. He was shaped by the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia, by the strict religion of Wahhabism, by the humiliations suffered by Arab states in wars with Israel, and by the power struggles of the Cold War. Before Osama bin Laden became the man the world came to know, he was a child born in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. His family background, the kingdom into which he was born, and the wider Arab world of the 1950s and 1960s are essential to understanding how he developed his worldview. Without this background, it is impossible to see clearly why he made the choices he did as an adult. Saudi Arabia in 1957 was a country in transition. It had only been founded 25 years earlier, in 1932, by King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, a leader who had unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under his rule after decades of tribal wars. For much of its early history, Saudi Arabia had been extremely poor. The majority of its people lived as nomads, moving with their animals across the desert, while small towns like Riyadh, Jeddah and Mecca provided little more than basic trade and religious life. The main source of importance for the kingdom was that it was home to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam. Every year, Muslims from around the world came to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj pilgrimage, giving the kingdom spiritual authority but not economic power. That situation changed dramatically with the discovery of oil. In 1938, American geologists working for the Arabian American Oil Company, known as Aramco, struck oil in large quantities. At first, the world did not yet rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil, but by the 1950s, demand had skyrocketed. Saudi Arabia suddenly found itself sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in the world. The money that came from oil exports gave the royal family enormous wealth and transformed the entire country. By the mid-1950s, highways were being built across the desert, modern airports connected Saudi cities to the wider world, and new schools and hospitals were being constructed. Where once people had lived in mud houses or tents, concrete buildings and modern offices began to appear. But modernization was only one side of Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the kingdom remained deeply conservative and religious. The political system was built on an alliance between the royal family, known as the House of Saud, and the Wahhabi clerics. Wahhabism is a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam that emphasizes literal reading of the Quran, rejection of innovations in religion, and strict social rules, especially regarding the separation of men and women, prayer and daily behavior. The clerics gave religious legitimacy to the monarchy, and in exchange, the monarchy supported them with wealth and authority. This arrangement meant that even as modern technology entered Saudi Arabia, strict Islamic rules governed public life. This balance created tension. On one hand, thousands of foreign engineers, technicians, and oil workers from the United States and Europe lived and worked in Saudi Arabia, especially in the oil regions near the Persian Gulf. They brought with them Western lifestyles, movies, music, and customs. On the other hand, religious leaders preached against foreign corruption and insisted that Saudi society must remain faithful to Islam. This constant push and pull between modern wealth and strict tradition shaped the environment into which Osama was born. Osama's own family embodied these contradictions. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, came from very humble beginnings. He was born around 1908 in Hadramaut, a poor region in southern Yemen. Like many Yemeni men of his generation, he left home as a teenager to find work in Saudi Arabia, a land of opportunity after the discovery of oil. He began as a laborer in construction, working with his hands as a mason. But Muhammad was not an ordinary laborer. He was hard-working, disciplined, and most importantly, loyal to those above him. These qualities earned him the trust of King Abdulaziz. Over time, Mohammed bin Laden rose from poverty to become one of the most powerful businessmen in the kingdom. He founded the Saudi Bin Laden Group, a construction company that eventually became the largest in Saudi Arabia. The company won massive government contracts, building roads, airports, and royal palaces. Muhammad's greatest honor came when he was awarded the responsibility of renovating and expanding Islam's holiest sites, the Grand Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. For ordinary Muslims, these projects were sacred, and for Muhammad they brought both religious prestige and immense wealth. By the 1950s, he was a billionaire by today's standards, and one of the closest associates of the royal family. Despite his success, Mohammed bin Laden lived a complicated personal life. He married more than 20 women over his lifetime and fathered more than 50 children. Because of the large number of wives, his children grew up in separate households, each with its own mother. Some of Muhammad's wives came from prominent Saudi families, while others, like Osama's mother, were from outside Saudi Arabia. Osama's mother, Alaya Ghanem, was from Latakia, a city on the Mediterranean coast of Syria. She was not among the most powerful or socially connected wives in the bin Laden household. Osama was her only child with Muhammad, which meant she had a particularly close bond with him. Relatives later described Osama as being deeply attached to his mother, respecting her guidance throughout his life. Osama's early childhood was marked by both privilege and loss. He was surrounded by wealth. His family lived in comfort that most Saudis could only dream of. He had access to the best schools in Jeddah and Riyadh, wore good clothes, and never lacked resources. But in 1967, when he was only 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash. This was a devastating moment for the bin Laden family. Mohammed had been the central figure holding together a vast business empire and a sprawling family. After his death, his older sons took over the Saudi Bin Laden Group, while the younger children, like Osama, were raised primarily by their mothers. For Osama, the death of his father deepened his dependence on his mother and shaped his sense of responsibility and seriousness at a young age. People who knew Osama as a child often described him as quiet, polite, and unusually religious for his age. Teachers said he was respectful and diligent. He was known for performing his prayers regularly and for memorizing large portions of the Quran. Unlike some of his wealthy brothers, Osama avoided luxury. He preferred modest clothes, lived simply, and seemed uninterested in the Western lifestyle that was increasingly available to Saudi elites. Instead, he admired Islamic heroes from history. His favorite was Saladin, the 12th century Muslim commander who fought the Crusaders and recaptured Jerusalem. For young Osama, Saladin represented the perfect Muslim leader, brave, pious, and victorious against foreign invaders. This admiration foreshadowed the self-image Osama would later adopt as a defender of Islam. But Osama's life as a boy was shaped not only by his family and religion, but also by the wider events in the Middle East. The year his father died, 1967, was also the year of the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbours. In less than a week, Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, seizing control of vast territories, including East Jerusalem. For Arabs, this was a humiliating defeat. For Muslims, the loss of Jerusalem, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was a spiritual and emotional blow. Osama was only 10, but he grew up in a society where this humiliation was discussed constantly, where the weakness of Arab armies and the suffering of Palestinians were major topics. These events left deep marks on the generation that came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, shaping their sense of grievance and identity. By the time Osama was a teenager, these influences had combined to form a clear pattern in his character. He was wealthy, but chose to live modestly. He was surrounded by modernization, but chose to embrace religion. He was part of a powerful family, but was drawn to ideas larger than personal success. His education in Jeddah exposed him to both modern subjects like mathematics and economics, and strict religious instruction under the Wahhabi curriculum. His teachers and peers saw him as serious, disciplined, and respectful. He was not the type to rebel against authority in small matters, but he carried within him a growing sense of duty to Islam and an awareness of the struggles of Muslims beyond Saudi Arabia. This is the foundation of Osama bin Laden's life. A child born into wealth, raised in a religious environment, shaped by the humiliation of his people in war, and inspired by the stories of Islamic heroes. These early experiences did not yet make him a terrorist or a global figure, but they formed the worldview of a man who would later dedicate himself to what he saw as the defense of Islam. By the late 1970s, Osama Bin Laden was no longer the quiet child who had lost his father at the age of 10. He was a young man entering adulthood in a kingdom that had changed dramatically in just 2 decades. Saudi Arabia was richer than ever before, transformed by the oil boom of the 1970s. The country was building highways, modern airports, and universities at a rapid pace. But beneath the surface of this modernization, there was also deep tension. The society remained religiously conservative, political freedoms were extremely limited, and the Arab world beyond Saudi Arabia was going through a period of turmoil and crisis. In this environment, Osama enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, one of the most prestigious universities in the kingdom. The university had been established in 1967, the same year his father died, and it quickly became a centre for the country's elite. At the time Osama attended, it was also a place where religious and political ideas were debated intensely, even though Saudi Arabia had no democratic system and little tolerance for political opposition. Universities often became the breeding ground for discussions that could not take place openly in politics. Osama's official studies were in economics and public administration. These were practical subjects that could have prepared him to play a role in the family business, the Saudi Bin Laden Group, or in government administration. Many of his half-brothers were already involved in the business empire, and his education could easily have set him up for a comfortable life as a businessman. But Osama's true education at King Abdulaziz University went far beyond economics. It was here that he encountered the ideas and teachers that would shape his ideology for the rest of his life. One of the most important influences on Osama at university was Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian Islamic scholar. Azzam was a charismatic teacher who spoke passionately about the duty of Muslims to defend their lands when they were under attack. He taught that jihad, meaning struggle, was an individual obligation for Muslims whenever Islamic territories were invaded. Azzam's lectures often focused on Palestine, since he himself had experienced displacement after the creation of Israel in 1948. For young Muslims like Osama, who had grown up hearing about the humiliation of Arab defeats in 1967 and 1973, Azzam's message was powerful. It gave a religious and moral framework to their sense of anger and grievance. Osama was also exposed to the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic political movement founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. The Brotherhood preached that Islam was not just a religion but a complete way of life that should guide politics, economics, and society. By the 1970s, many members of the Brotherhood had fled Egypt and other Arab countries where they were repressed, and some found refuge in Saudi Arabia. Their ideas spread into Saudi schools and universities. For Osama, the Brotherhood's emphasis on Islam as a political system reinforced what he had already learned in Wahhabi religious classes, that Islam must be protected not only in personal life but also in society as a whole. The political climate of the Arab world at the time also played a crucial role. The 1967 Six-Day War had left Arabs humiliated, with Israel occupying East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. The 1973 Yom Kippur War brought some temporary pride when Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks on Israel, but the war ended with another Israeli victory, and Arab frustration deepened. These military defeats led many Arabs to lose faith in secular Arab nationalism, which had been promoted by leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser had promised that Arab unity and socialism would bring strength, but by the 1970s those promises looked empty. Into this vacuum stepped Islamic movements which argued that only Islam could unite and protect Muslims. Saudi Arabia itself was deeply affected by these regional events. The royal family used oil wealth to project influence across the Muslim world. After the 1973 war, Saudi Arabia led an oil embargo against Western countries that supported Israel, showing the power of oil as a political weapon. At the same time, the kingdom invested billions of dollars in Islamic charities, schools, and organizations, spreading its conservative interpretation of Islam far beyond its borders. Osama grew up in a society where religion was not just personal faith but also international politics. At university, Osama was remembered as a quiet but committed student. He was not a rebel, not loud or confrontational, but he was serious, disciplined, and deeply devout. His professors and classmates described him as generous with charity, respectful in manner, and devoted to prayer. He lived modestly, even though his family's wealth could have given him access to luxury. This modest lifestyle made him stand out among other sons of privilege, many of whom enjoyed Western movies, cars, and foreign trips. Osama chose instead to spend time with religious groups and with students influenced by Islamist thinkers. His worldview was beginning to take shape. He saw the Muslim world as being under threat, both from within and from outside. From within, he believed many Muslim rulers were corrupt, too close to Western powers, and too distant from Islamic principles. From outside, he saw Western influence, particularly American military presence and support for Israel, as direct challenges to Islam. For Osama, the solution was not political reform in the Western sense, nor secular nationalism, but a return to Islamic principles and a willingness to fight in defense of the Muslim community. The timing of his ideological formation is crucial. In 1979, when Osama was 22 years old, two dramatic events shook the Muslim world. The first was the Iranian Revolution, in which the Shah of Iran, a close ally of the United States, was overthrown and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. Although Khomeini was Shia and Osama was Sunni, the revolution proved that an Islamic movement could overthrow a powerful ruler and challenge Western dominance. The second was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which began in December 1979. For Osama and many others, this invasion was a direct attack on Muslim lands by an atheistic superpower. It became the defining moment that turned ideology into action. Thus, Osama bin Laden's university years were not just a time of study. They were the years in which he absorbed the ideas of Abdullah Azzam, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Wahhabi clerics. The years in which the failures of Arab nationalism and the victories of Islamic movements convinced him that only religion could guide society, and the years in which the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan provided him with a battlefield to put these ideas into practice. By the early 1980s, Osama had completed his studies, but he was already far from the path of a normal businessman or a quiet student. He had developed a worldview that combined religious devotion, political awareness, and a growing belief in jihad as a personal duty. For him, the question was no longer whether Muslims should resist foreign domination, but how they should do it and where the fight should begin. The answer would soon come from the mountains of Afghanistan. By the late 1970s, Osama bin Laden had finished his university years and was becoming known for his religious devotion and his seriousness. He had been influenced by Islamic scholars, especially Abdullah Azzam, who taught that Muslims had a duty to defend their fellow Muslims when they were attacked. His ideas about Islam as a complete system of life had been reinforced by the teachings of the Muslim Brotherhood and by Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi environment. But up until this point, Osama was still mostly a young man of wealth and privilege, respected for his piety but not yet a fighter. The events of 1979 would change that forever. That year was one of the most dramatic in the modern history of the Muslim world. Three major events occurred almost back to back, each of which deeply influenced Osama bin Laden's generation. The first was the Iranian Revolution in February 1979, when the Shah of Iran, who had been a close ally of the United States, was overthrown. The revolution replaced him with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who established the world's first modern Islamic republic. Although Osama was Sunni and Khomeini was Shia, the revolution sent a powerful message across the Muslim world. It was possible to overthrow a powerful ruler backed by the West if people united under Islam. The second event came in November 1979, when a group of militants stormed the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam, claiming that the Saudi royal family had become corrupt and that the Mahdi, the messianic figure in Islamic belief, had arrived. The Saudi government, with help from French commandos, retook the mosque after 2 weeks of bloodshed. This shook Saudi Arabia to its core, convincing the royal family to give even more power to the religious establishment in order to preserve its legitimacy. The third and most decisive event was in December 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan was a turning point for the global Muslim community. Afghanistan was a poor, mountainous country with a conservative Islamic society. In 1978, a communist-backed government had seized power in Kabul, leading to widespread unrest and rebellion in the countryside. When the Soviets sent their army to support this government, it was seen by many Muslims as a foreign atheist superpower occupying an Islamic land. For Osama bin Laden and for many others, this was not just another Cold War conflict. It was a call to arms, a religious duty. News of the invasion spread rapidly across the Muslim world. Religious leaders declared that Muslims everywhere must help the Afghan people. Friday sermons in mosques across the Middle East spoke about jihad against the Soviets. For young Muslims inspired by the idea of defending their faith, Afghanistan became the central battlefield of their time. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States also played a key role. For Saudi Arabia, supporting the Afghan jihad was both a religious and a political move. It allowed the kingdom to channel its wealth into a cause that was popular with its clerics and people. For Pakistan, which shared a long border with Afghanistan, the war was a matter of national security and regional influence. For the United States, it was part of the Cold War strategy, weakening the Soviet Union by supporting its enemies. This created a powerful alliance. Billions of dollars of aid, weapons, and training were funneled into Afghanistan, mostly through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI. The Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, were supported with rifles, missiles, and supplies. But the war was not only about Afghans. Volunteers from across the Muslim world began travelling to Pakistan and Afghanistan to join the fight. These men became known as the Afghan Arabs. It was into this context that Osama Bin Laden entered. In the early 1980s, he began travelling between Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. At first, his role was not that of a fighter on the front lines. Osama was not known for personal combat or military expertise. Instead, his contributions came from his wealth, his organisational skills, and his religious commitment. Using his family resources, he funded guest houses in Pakistan, where Arab volunteers could stay before moving into Afghanistan. He built roads, arranged supplies, and financed construction projects to support the Mujahideen. He also gave money directly to fighters and provided equipment. Alongside Abdullah Azam, Osama helped establish Maktab al-Khidamat, MEKE, which means the Services Bureau. MEKE was created to coordinate the arrival of foreign volunteers, channel donations, and provide logistical support for the jihad. Its headquarters was in Peshawar, a Pakistani city near the Afghan border. MEKE became the main gateway for Arabs who wanted to fight in Afghanistan. They would arrive in Pakistan, be housed in MEKE guest houses, trained in camps, and then sent into Afghanistan. This period was critical for Osama bin Laden. For the first time, he was building an international network. He met volunteers from across the Muslim world, Egyptians, Algerians, Yemenis, Jordanians, and others. He also established ties with Afghan commanders and Pakistani officials. Most importantly, he gained credibility. He was not just a wealthy Saudi writing checks. He travelled into Afghanistan, visited the front lines, and was seen praying and encouraging fighters. While his military role was limited, his willingness to risk his life in dangerous conditions impressed many. In Western account, Osama's role in the Afghan war has sometimes been exaggerated or misunderstood. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, did provide large amounts of aid to the Afghan Mujahideen, but that aid was directed mainly to Afghan groups through Pakistan's ISI, not directly to Osama or other Arab volunteers. Still, Osama's activities benefited from the larger environment created by this alliance. The infrastructure of jihad that developed in the 1980s, money, weapons, safe houses, training camps, was the same infrastructure he would later use for Al-Qaeda. The war itself was brutal. The Soviet Union deployed more than 100,000 troops to Afghanistan, using tanks, helicopters, and heavy artillery against poorly armed guerrilla fighters. Villages were bombed, civilians killed, and millions of Afghans fled as refugees into Pakistan and Iran. The Mujahideen fought back with guerrilla tactics, ambushing Soviet convoys and striking bases in the mountains. With the introduction of American Stinger missiles in the mid-1980s, Afghan fighters gained the ability to shoot down Soviet helicopters, changing the balance of the war. For Osama, Afghanistan became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol. It was proof that Muslims could come together from different countries and defeat a superpower. It gave him confidence that Islam could stand against even the most powerful enemies. It also gave him a base of followers who admired his dedication and his wealth. These followers would later form the nucleus of Al-Qaeda. But there were divisions within the movement. Many Afghans viewed the Arab volunteers as outsiders, who did not fully understand local conditions. Some Afghan commanders saw Osama and the MEK as useful sources of money, but not central to the war effort. Nonetheless, Osama persisted, convinced that his role was meaningful. and that the jihad in Afghanistan was a model for future struggles. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was weakening. The war had become costly and unpopular at home. In 1989, the Soviets withdrew their forces from Afghanistan, leaving the communist government in Kabul to fight on its own. For Osama bin Laden, this was a moment of triumph. He saw the Soviet withdrawal as proof that jihad worked, that Muslims united under Islam could defeat even a superpower. This lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. However, not everything ended well. The death of Abdullah Azzam in 1989, killed in a car bomb explosion in Peshawar, removed Osama's most important mentor. Some believe that rival groups within the jihad movement may have been responsible for the assassination, but the truth was never fully proven. Azzam's death left Osama as one of the most prominent figures among the Arab volunteers. It also created a vacuum in leadership which Osama began to fill. The Soviet-Afghan War was thus the crucible in which Osama bin Laden was transformed. He entered as a wealthy young man from Saudi Arabia with religious convictions and a desire to help. He left as the leader of an international network of fighters and supporters, with a belief that jihad could change the course of history. For him, Afghanistan was not the end but the beginning. The network's experiences and confidence he gained during the 1980s would soon be directed toward new targets. When the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, the war was seen by many Muslims as a victory for Islam. The Afghan Mujahideen, supported by international volunteers, had resisted one of the world's two superpowers and forced it to retreat. For Osama bin Laden, this was not just a military victory but a spiritual one. It proved in his mind that when Muslims united under the banner of faith, they could defeat even the most powerful enemies. The lessons of Afghanistan shaped his vision for the future. But what to do after the Soviets left? This question divided the fighters and their supporters. Many Afghans believed the struggle should now focus on building a government in Afghanistan. For them, the priority was their own country, which had been devastated by a decade of war. But for Osama and many Arab volunteers, Afghanistan was not just about Afghanistan, it was about the larger Muslim world. They believed the victory against the Soviets was only the first step in a broader struggle to defend Islam against all foreign influence. It was during this time, in the late 1980s, that Osama bin Laden and a small group of close associates began to lay the foundations for what would become Al-Qaeda. The Arabic word Al-Qaeda means the base or the foundation. The name reflected their idea of creating a permanent organization that could continue the jihad beyond Afghanistan. The group was small at first, made up mostly of Arabs who had fought in Afghanistan, men who trusted Osama's leadership and were inspired by his vision. The original purpose of Al-Qaeda was not entirely clear, even to its founders. Some accounts suggest it began simply as a database of fighters and supporters, a list of men who had come to Afghanistan and could be called upon for future battles. Others describe it as a formal structure with training camps, a leadership council, and a long-term strategy. What is certain is that Osama and his companions saw the need to preserve the networks they had built during the Afghan war. They did not want the momentum to be lost once the Soviets were gone. At the same time, Osama was becoming more outspoken in his views about the Muslim world. He argued that Muslims were not only under attack from external enemies like the Soviets, but also betrayed by their own governments. In his view, many Muslim rulers were corrupt, too close to the West and unwilling to defend Islam properly. His criticisms became sharper, especially toward his own homeland of Saudi Arabia. After the Afghan war, Osama returned to Saudi Arabia as something of a hero. Many Saudis admired the Mujahideen for their struggle against the Soviets, and Osama's role as a wealthy volunteer who had supported the jihad gave him respect. He gave speeches in mosques and gatherings, speaking about the importance of continuing jihad wherever Muslims were oppressed. For some, he was a source of inspiration. For the Saudi royal family, however, he was becoming a problem. His speeches hinted at criticism of the monarchy, and his increasing fame made him harder to control. The real turning point came in 1990, when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded neighbouring Kuwait. The invasion shocked the Arab world. Saddam had one of the largest armies in the Middle East, and within days his forces had overrun Kuwait, threatening to advance further into Saudi Arabia itself. The Saudi royal family suddenly faced a crisis. Osama bin Laden saw this as a moment for action. He went to the Saudi leadership with a bold proposal. He offered to mobilize his network of veterans from Afghanistan. the so-called Afghan Arabs, to defend the kingdom. He argued that Muslims should defend their own holy land without the need for foreign troops. He believed he could use his experience, his men, and his resources to build a defense against Saddam Hussein's army. But the Saudi rulers did not accept his offer. They did not trust Osama's volunteers to stop Saddam's tanks and modern military. Instead, King Fahd made a historic decision. He invited the United States and other Western powers to send troops to Saudi Arabia to defend the kingdom. American forces, along with soldiers from other allied countries, arrived in the land of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina. For Osama bin Laden, this was a betrayal of the highest order. To him, the presence of non-Muslim troops in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam and home to its holiest sites, was unacceptable. He saw it as a violation of Islamic principles, an insult to Muslim dignity, and proof that the Saudi monarchy was corrupt and dependent on outsiders. While the royal family argued that they had no choice, that Saddam's threat was too great, Osama refused to accept this reasoning. The Gulf War of 1990-91 unfolded with American-led coalition forces driving Saddam's army out of Kuwait. Militarily, it was a success for the coalition. Politically, it left deep divisions in the Muslim world. For many, the war was proof of American dominance in the region. For Osama, it was the moment that convinced him the United States was now the main enemy of Islam. Before this, his focus had been on communists and foreign occupiers like the Soviets. After this, his focus shifted to the Americans and their allies, especially the Saudi royal family. In the months after the war, Osama became increasingly vocal. He criticized the Saudi monarchy in private and sometimes in public, denouncing their decision to allow American troops onto Saudi soil. The government, alarmed by his growing influence, began to restrict him. His passport was confiscated. His movements were monitored. Yet Osama continued to speak out, drawing support from those who shared his anger at the foreign presence. It was during this period that Al-Qaeda began to take a clearer shape. No longer just a loose network from Afghanistan, it was becoming a structured organization with a defined ideology. Its members believed that the greatest threat to Islam came not only from outside powers like the United States, but also from Muslim governments that cooperated with them. They saw jihad not only as defense but also as a tool for revolution. The combination of the Afghan war experience, the founding of Al-Qaeda, and the Gulf War crisis transformed Osama bin Laden from a wealthy religious activist into a political and military leader. He was now no longer simply financing jihad, he was positioning himself as a challenger to both Western powers and Muslim rulers. This was the point of no return. By 1991, his relationship with the Saudi royal family had collapsed. Once considered a patriotic son of the kingdom, he was now viewed as a dangerous critic. His speeches and writings were considered subversive, and his influence was spreading beyond Saudi Arabia. Faced with growing pressure, Osama bin Laden would soon leave his homeland, never to return permanently. His next destination would be Sudan, where he would build the next phase of his struggle. By 1991, Osama bin Laden's relationship with his homeland of Saudi Arabia had broken down. The Gulf War had been a turning point, and Osama's anger at the presence of American troops in the land of the two holy mosques had put him in direct conflict with the Saudi royal family. For the monarchy, Osama had become a problem they could not control. For Osama, Saudi Arabia had betrayed Islam by inviting foreign soldiers to defend it. His speeches and growing influence made him dangerous to the authorities. Under increasing pressure, Osama decided to leave Saudi Arabia. He would not return as a free man. His destination was Sudan, a country in northeast Africa that at the time was offering refuge to Islamist movements from across the Muslim world. Sudan had recently undergone a dramatic political shift. In 1989, a coup had brought to power a coalition of military officers and Islamists, led by Hassan al-Turabi, a prominent Sudanese Islamist thinker. Turabi envisioned Sudan as a hub for Islamic movements, a place where militants, intellectuals, and leaders could gather, find support, and build networks. For Osama bin Laden, Sudan seemed like the perfect place to continue his struggle after leaving Saudi Arabia. In 1992, Osama arrived in Sudan with several of his wives, children, and followers. Unlike many exiles who lose their resources when they flee, Osama carried with him a portion of his fortune. Although Saudi Arabia had restricted some of his assets, he still had access to significant wealth through his family connections and personal businesses. In Sudan, he invested heavily in agriculture, construction, and trade. He purchased farmland, built roads, and established businesses in Khartoum, the capital. At first glance, he appeared to be a wealthy businessman bringing investment to a poor country. But Osama's activities in Sudan were not limited to business. Alongside his commercial ventures, he began building a new base for his militant activities. He established training camps for his followers and provided safe houses for fighters from different countries. Sudan under Turabi welcomed Islamist movements from Algeria, Egypt, Palestine and elsewhere. Khartoum became a meeting point for militants, scholars and exiles. Osama's wealth and reputation from the Afghan war made him a respected figure in this circle. During these years, Al-Qaeda began to evolve from a small network into something more ambitious. In Afghanistan, it had been a loose collection of Arab volunteers. In Sudan, it began to take on the features of an international organization. Fighters were trained not only in military tactics, but also in ideology. The goal was no longer just to fight in Afghanistan or to defend a single country. The goal was to build a global movement that could strike at enemies of Islam wherever they were. One of the key regions of activity during this time was East Africa. Sudan was geographically close to countries like Somalia and Kenya, where Islamic movements were gaining momentum. In 1993, Somali militants fighting against United Nations and US forces received support from networks linked to Osama. The most famous incident came in October 1993, when Somali fighters shot down 2 American Black Hawk helicopters in Mogadishu, killing 18 US soldiers. Although Osama himself was not directly involved in the battle, later investigations revealed that his associates had provided training and support to Somali fighters in the period leading up to the clash. This event deeply shocked the United States and convinced Osama that America was vulnerable if targeted directly. At the same time, Osama began financing operations in Yemen, the land of his father's birth. Yemen was unstable after the unification of North and South Yemen in 1990, and Osama saw it as another potential front for jihad. His networks attempted small attacks and tried to recruit supporters there. Sudan also became a safe haven for militants fleeing from Egypt and Algeria. In Egypt, the government of Hosni Mubarak was cracking down on Islamist groups like Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya and Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Many of their members escaped to Sudan, where they found support from Osama's network. In Algeria, a brutal civil war had broken out after the military cancelled elections that an Islamist party was set to win in 9. Militants from Algeria also passed through Sudan, bringing with them stories of massacres and repression. For Osama, these connections reinforced his belief that Muslim governments allied with the West were corrupt and illegitimate, and that jihad against them was justified. While Osama's reputation among militants grew, his relationship with the wider world became more strained. Western governments, especially the United States, began to see him as more than just a wealthy Saudi exile. His name appeared in intelligence reports linking him to militant activities in Africa and the Middle East. Saudi Arabia itself cut off his citizenship in 1994, stripping him of his passport and nationality. This was a symbolic moment. Osama Bin Laden, once the son of one of Saudi Arabia's wealthiest families and a respected figure, was now officially a man without a country. Yet in Sudan, he was protected. The government of Hassan al-Turabi valued his money and his networks. Osama funded infrastructure projects in Sudan, including roads and farms, which won him goodwill among some Sudanese. His presence was tolerated because it fit into Sudan's role as a hub for Islamist movements. However, the pressure on Sudan grew. By the mid-1990s, the United States was becoming more alarmed at the activities of militants based in Khartoum. Attacks and plots traced back to Sudan, including attempts on Egyptian officials, led Washington to pressure the Sudanese government to expel Osama. Saudi Arabia also lobbied against him, warning Sudan that his presence was damaging their international relations. In 1996, the pressure became too great. Sudan, facing diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions, asked Osama bin Laden to leave. For Osama, this was a setback, but also an opportunity. He had used his time in Sudan to strengthen his organization, expand his contacts, and build a financial base. Now, forced out, he needed a new safe haven. The answer lay in the country where his jihad had begun, Afghanistan. By the mid-1990s, Afghanistan was once again in turmoil. After the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the Afghan communist government collapsed, and rival mujahideen factions turned on each other, plunging the country into civil war. Out of this chaos emerged a new movement, the Taliban, a group of religious students and fighters who promised to restore order and enforce strict Islamic law. By 1996, they had captured Kabul and controlled most of the country. Afghanistan once again became a land where foreign militants could find refuge. In May 1996, Osama Bin Laden left Sudan after 4 years of exile. International pressure had grown too heavy on the Sudanese government, and they could no longer protect him. Saudi Arabia had stripped him of his citizenship in 1994, making him a man without a country. He was wanted by the United States, condemned by his homeland, and watched closely by intelligence services around the world. Yet instead of disappearing into obscurity, Osama was about to enter the most significant phase of his life. His destination was Afghanistan, the country where he had first gained fame as a supporter of the jihad against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Afghanistan in 1996 was a land in ruins. The Soviets had withdrawn in 1989, and the communist government they left behind finally collapsed in 1992. But instead of peace, the victory led to civil war. Rival mujahideen factions that had once fought together against the Soviets now turned their weapons on each other. Kabul, the capital, became a battlefield, divided between warlords who shelled the city mercilessly. Civilians suffered, and the dream of a peaceful Islamic state in Afghanistan seemed further away than ever. Out of this chaos emerged a new force known as the Taliban. The Taliban began as a movement of religious students. Taliban means students in Pashto, who were trained in Islamic seminaries, many of them located in Pakistan. Their leader was Mullah Muhammad Omar, a reclusive cleric who had fought in the Soviet War and lost an eye in battle. The Taliban promised to end the chaos, disarm the warlords, and impose strict Islamic law. They gained support from many Afghans who were tired of war and lawlessness. By 1996, the Taliban had captured Kabul, executed former President Najibullah, and established themselves as the rulers of most of Afghanistan. It was into this environment that Osama bin Laden arrived. For him, Afghanistan was both familiar and strategic. It was familiar because he had spent much of the 1980s here, supporting the fight against the Soviets. It was strategic because the Taliban were not yet recognized by most of the world, and they were willing to host foreign militants who pledged loyalty to their cause. Unlike Sudan, which had been under constant international pressure, Afghanistan offered Osama a safe haven in a land where the central government was weak, the terrain was rugged, and outside powers had little control. When Osama arrived in Afghanistan, he quickly established contact with the Taliban leadership. At first, there was some hesitation. The Taliban were primarily focused on consolidating their rule in Afghanistan, not on global jihad, but Osama had several advantages. First, he had money, which he used to support Taliban operations. Second, he had prestige as a veteran of the anti-Soviet jihad. Third, he had followers, Arabs and other foreign fighters, who could strengthen the Taliban militarily. Over time, Osama and the Taliban built a relationship based on mutual benefit. The Taliban gave him protection and freedom to operate, while he gave them resources, fighters, and international connections. With Taliban protection, Osama set about rebuilding Al-Qaeda. In the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, he established training camps where recruits from across the Muslim world were trained in guerrilla warfare, explosives, and ideology. These camps became the backbone of Al-Qaeda's operations. Fighters from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond came to Afghanistan to receive training before returning to their home countries or being deployed on missions abroad. The camps also created a sense of unity among militants from diverse backgrounds, forging a shared identity around jihad and loyalty to Al-Qaeda. But Osama's ambitions had grown beyond Afghanistan. In 1996, he issued his first public declaration of jihad against the United States. In this statement, he denounced the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, which had been stationed there since the Gulf War. He accused the United States of occupying the land of the two holy mosques and of exploiting Muslim resources, particularly oil. He framed the struggle not as one against communism, as in the 1980s, but against what he now saw as a new global enemy, the United States and its allies. This was a shift in Osama's strategy. During the Afghan War, his focus had been on fighting foreign invaders in Muslim lands, like the Soviets. Now, he was moving toward what he called the far enemy strategy. He believed that local Muslim rulers like the Saudi monarchy or the Egyptian government were corrupt and oppressive, but they were only able to stay in power because of US support. Therefore, instead of focusing on the near enemy of local regimes, Al-Qaeda would focus on the far enemy of the United States. If the US could be forced out of the Middle East, Osama believed, the local regimes would collapse on their own. In 1998, Osama escalated his rhetoric further. He joined forces with Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and together they issued a fatwa, or religious decree, under the name of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. This fatwa declared it the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans and their allies, both civilian and military, wherever they could be found. This was a direct declaration of war against the United States. Osama's words were soon followed by action. On August 7, 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out coordinated attacks on US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Truck bombs exploded outside the embassy buildings, killing more than 200 people and injuring thousands. The majority of the victims were African civilians, not Americans. The attacks shocked the world and marked Al-Qaeda as a deadly international terrorist organization. In response, the United States launched cruise missile strikes on Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and on a factory in Sudan that Washington claimed was producing chemical weapons linked to Al-Qaeda. The strikes killed several militants but missed Osama himself. 2 years later, on October 12, 2000, Al-Qaeda struck again, this time against a US warship. The USS Cole, a Navy destroyer, was refueling in the port of Aden in Yemen, when a small boat packed with explosives rammed into its side. The blast tore a massive hole in the ship, killing 17 American sailors and injuring dozens more. Once again, Osama's network had shown its ability to hit US targets abroad, and once again, it drew global attention to Al-Qaeda. During these years, Osama also became a symbol in the media. Western journalists travelled to Afghanistan to interview him, publishing reports that described him as tall, soft-spoken and calm, living in simple conditions despite his wealth. To his supporters, these interviews portrayed him as a pious leader who had given up luxury to fight for Islam. To his enemies, they showed a dangerous man who was openly calling for attacks against the United States. The Taliban, meanwhile, faced growing pressure for harbouring Osama. The United States demanded that Mullah Omar hand him over. The Taliban refused, partly out of loyalty and partly because they saw Osama as a guest under their protection, which carried deep cultural and religious weight in Afghan society. This refusal further isolated the Taliban internationally, but they calculated that Osama's resources and fighters were too valuable to give up. By the turn of the millennium, Osama Bin Laden had transformed Al-Qaeda into a truly global network. His training camps in Afghanistan had produced thousands of militants. His fatwas had declared war on the United States. His attacks had killed hundreds, and his alliance with the Taliban gave him a safe haven from which to plan even bigger operations. For Osama, the embassy bombings and the USS Cole attack were just steps toward a larger goal. He believed that spectacular attacks were needed to shock the United States into retreating from the Muslim world. In his mind, the Afghan jihad had defeated the Soviet Union, and now a new jihad could drive out the Americans. He was preparing for something unprecedented, something that would not just target US interests abroad, but strike directly at the heart of the United States itself. The stage was set for September 11, 2001. Now we come to the moment that changed everything. The attacks of September 11, 2000. This is the section of the story that most people already know by name, but the full facts and the chain of events that led to that morning are complex, long in the making, and worth describing carefully. To understand 9/11 properly, we must look at how the plot developed over years, who the main actors were, what practical steps they took without describing anything that could be used to copy their actions, how the attacks were carried out on the day, and what the immediate and global effects were afterward. I will explain each element in clear factual language so that someone with no prior knowledge can follow. The idea of using airplanes as weapons did not spring up overnight. In the late 1990s, a core group of Al-Qaeda leaders developed a vision of large, spectacular attacks that would do two things at once: inflict mass casualties and force the United States to pay a high political and military price for its presence and policies in the Middle East. Several planners and strategists in the network contributed concept. One of the central figures who later took credit for the plan was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a Pakistani-born militant who had joined militant causes in his youth and who by the late 1990s had become a senior operational planner for Al-Qaeda. He proposed high-impact, large-scale operations, and he presented the idea of hijacking passenger airliners and using them as flying bombs to strike critical targets. Osama Bin Laden, already the ideological leader of Al-Qaeda and the man who had authorized earlier attacks such as the 1998 embassy bombings, was convinced of the potential impact. According to later investigations and public statements by Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden approved a plan in the late 1990s that would strike major American landmarks. The operational work required to turn that idea into reality unfolded over several years. The plot involved recruitment of operatives, training, logistics, financial transfers, travel across borders, and covert communications. Al-Qaeda drew on a pool of men who had fought in Afghanistan or who had been radicalized in other countries. Some operatives came through established networks in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Others, particularly a group of recruits known as the Hamburg Cell, were radicalized while studying in Germany and then were drawn into the plot. The plotters focused on selecting young men who could get into the United States on student or tourist visas, enroll in domestic flight training, and then carry out the planned attacks. Over time, a group of 19 hijackers emerged as the force to carry out the operation. Their ranks contained men from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Lebanon. Among the better-known names were Mohammed Atta, who served as a leading operative and one of the pilots, and Ramzi bin al-Shibeh, who played a role in coordination from abroad. Training was a crucial part of the preparation. The operatives studied in flight schools in the United States and elsewhere to learn basic piloting skills. These lessons were practical and limited in scope, as needed for the plotters' objectives. In parallel, many members of the group worked to blend into ordinary life in the United States, opening bank accounts, renting apartments, getting driver's licenses, and moving through daily routines so as to avoid drawing attention. Financial support came from a variety of sources, including donations, formal or informal transfers, and the exploitation of charitable networks, sometimes in ways that were legitimate at the surface and used deceptively beneath it. Over time, the group assembled the resources it needed without attracting the level of scrutiny that would have exposed the plot earlier. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies in the United States and other countries did pick up pieces of Al-Qaeda's activity over the years, leading up to 2001. Some records show that different agencies had individual suspicions, phone conversations, visa applications, travel patterns, but these pieces were scattered across jurisdictions and databases. The US intelligence community later acknowledged that failures of communication and analysis occurred. The 9/11 Commission, created after the attacks to study causes and failures, concluded that the attacks were enabled in part by structural problems in intelligence sharing and by underestimation of Al-Qaeda's willingness and capacity to commit such a mass casualty operation on US soil. Those findings would later drive major changes in how intelligence agencies cooperate and how airports and airline security are managed. The final operational phase of the plot took shape in the late summer and early autumn of 2001. Men arrived in the United States and final instructions were given. On the morning of Tuesday, September 11, 19 hijackers boarded 4 commercial jets in American airports. The composition of the teams was such that each flight had multiple hijackers, with at least one trained as a pilot on each of the aircraft that were to be flown into targets. The 4 flights selected that morning were all transcontinental or medium-range airliners that departed from the northeastern United States. Without providing procedural specifics, it is important to record the factual sequence of events and the human cost. Shortly after takeoff, the hijackers overtook the cabins. On 2 flights, the planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, New York. The first aircraft struck the North Tower in the morning hours. The second hit the South Tower soon after. The impacts caused massive structural damage, fires, and the eventual collapse of both towers. The third plane crashed into the western side of the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., causing severe damage to the U.S. Department of Defense headquarters. The 4th aircraft did not reach its intended target because passengers and crew attempted to retake control. That aircraft crashed in a field in rural Pennsylvania. In total, nearly 3,000 people were killed that day. The victims included passengers and crew, office workers, first responders, and people in the buildings and on the ground who had no connection to the attackers. The scale of loss and the images of smoke, collapsing towers, and desperate rescue efforts produced shock and grief around the world. The immediate response on the ground in the United States was chaotic and heroic. Firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical teams rushed into dangerous conditions to rescue anyone they could. Ordinary citizens organized to help. People donated blood, offered shelter, and assisted in search and rescue. At the national level, airline traffic was halted. The US airspace was closed for the first time in history, and emergency measures were enacted. The US government, led by President George W. Bush, proclaimed a national emergency and began to plan a response against the organization that had taken responsibility. The question of responsibility was not long in coming. Al-Qaeda and Osama Bin Laden were quickly identified as having operational responsibility and ideological justification for the attacks. Al-Qaeda had previously declared a campaign against American targets and had claimed credit for other mass casualty attacks, so there was a clear line in investigators' view between Al-Qaeda's ideology and the execution of the 9/11 operation. The US government formally demanded that the Taliban government in Afghanistan hand over Al-Qaeda leaders. The Taliban refused. This refusal set the stage for the American response. Within days of the attack, the United States launched a military campaign in Afghanistan named Operation Enduring Freedom. The objective was to remove Al-Qaeda's safe haven, to capture or kill senior operatives, and to deny the Taliban a government that could host international terrorism. The US invasion began with airstrikes and special operations forces. Over the following months, coalition forces worked with local Afghan factions opposed to the Taliban to dislodge the regime and target Al-Qaeda strongholds. The Taliban government was removed from power in Kabul by the end of 2001, and many Al-Qaeda operatives fled into the border regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan's remote mountain areas. The fight against Al-Qaeda did not end in 2001, rather it shifted into a protracted manhunt and a long counterinsurgency effort. The consequences of September 11 reached far beyond immediate military operations. In the United States, policy changes were sweeping. Congress passed new laws aimed at improving intelligence collection and information sharing, and the lead security agency underwent significant reorganization. The Transportation Security Administration was created to regulate and manage airport security. The Patriot Act expanded government surveillance and investigative powers, a move that supporters argued was necessary for national security and that critics warned could undermine civil liberties. Airports and airlines implemented strict new safety procedures. International aviation took new forms of security screening, and the way governments and societies adapted to the possibility of mass casualty terrorism changed permanently. Internationally, the attacks reshaped alliances and policy. Many countries expressed solidarity with the United States, even when they disagreed with the strategy that followed. The US also drew on a coalition of willing partners to pursue Al-Qaeda and its affiliates around the globe. At the same time, 9/11 created new tensions. Military campaigns in Afghanistan and later Iraq produced debates about the proper scope of US power, the importance of international law, and the long-term strategic consequences of foreign military intervention. The wars that followed had deep human and material costs, and they provoked heated public and academic debates about their causes and consequences. The attacks also produced social and cultural impacts, particularly for Muslim communities around the world. In many countries, Muslim citizens experienced a rise in suspicion, surveillance, and sometimes outright hostility. Acts of discrimination and violence against civilians who were Muslim or perceived to be Muslim increased in the weeks and months after 9/11. Many Muslim leaders and communities publicly condemned the attacks and emphasized that killing civilians is not justified by religion. The debate about causes often included references to foreign policy grievances, such as US military presence in the Middle East, sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that extremists cited as motives for violence. But mainstream scholars and religious leaders rejected violence and argued for political solutions within the rule of law. A detailed accounting of intelligence failures followed. The 9/11 Commission, an independent bipartisan panel, was created to examine the circumstances that allowed the attacks to happen and to make recommendations for the future. Its report, issued in 2004, presented a long list of systemic failures: fragmented intelligence organizations, inadequate information sharing, underestimation of the terrorist threat, and failures in immigration and visa tracking that allowed some plotters to enter and move within the United States. The commission made a series of reforms to reduce the chance of a similar intelligence breakdown repeating, including creating a Director of National Intelligence to coordinate different agencies and improving cross-agency data sharing. In the years after 9/11, Al-Qaeda's brand and structure changed. The organization's central leadership was weakened by targeted actions, including special operations raids, intelligence cooperation among countries, and capture or killing of senior figures. At the same time, Al-Qaeda's ideology inspired a network of affiliates and imitators around the world. Groups in Yemen, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, and elsewhere either allied themselves with Al-Qaeda's leadership or used similar rhetoric. Some groups committed attacks against local governments or Western targets. The diffusion of the movement made it harder to eliminate the underlying ideology and required sustained international counter-terrorism cooperation. The human toll of 9/11 was immense. Nearly 3,000 people from dozens of nations died on that single day. Beyond the immediate fatalities, many survivors and first responders suffered long-term health effects, including respiratory illnesses and mental health trauma. The war and security measures that followed caused additional civilian casualties and displacement in the countries affected by combat. The global economic impact was also significant. Markets tumbled in the immediate aftermath. Industries such as aviation and tourism were heavily affected, and long-term defense and security spending increased dramatically in many countries. There were also long debates about the legality and ethics of responses to 9/11. The United States adopted programs that detained suspects in locations outside of normal judicial processes, renditions or transfers of detainees to third countries, and the use of military commissions in places such as Guantanamo Bay became focal points of legal and human rights disputes. Critics argued that some counter-terrorism measures compromised principles of due process, while supporters argued that exceptional threats required exceptional responses. These legal and moral debates continue to this day because they touch on fundamental questions about how democracies protect citizens without losing foundational liberties. From the perspective of Osama Bin Laden and his supporters, the attacks were framed as a successful strike against the far enemy. They claim to have struck at the symbols and mechanisms of US power to force a political and military change. From the perspective of the vast majority of people around the world, including most Muslims, the attacks were an act of mass murder that targeted innocent civilians and could not be justified. For analysts and historians, the attacks are best understood as the result of an extremist ideology that exploited grievances, institutional gaps, and global networks built during earlier conflicts. In the wake of 9/11, many governments, intelligence agencies, scholars, and civil society groups took up the task of understanding how to prevent similar attacks in the future. Some reforms focused on technical fixes, improving passenger screening, tightening visa processes, and expanding intelligence cooperation. Other reforms emphasized addressing long-term drivers of extremism, governance failures, corruption, unresolved political conflicts, poverty, and lack of education opportunities in vulnerable communities. The consensus among many experts became that no single approach, military, legal, or social, would be sufficient on its own. Combating violent extremism required a mix of law enforcement, diplomacy, development, and efforts to counter ideologies that promote violence. Finally, the attacks of September 11, 2001, left an indelible mark on global consciousness. They changed how people travel, how nations cooperate on security, and how societies think about risk and resilience. They also shaped foreign policy debates for decades. The legacy of that day is complex, a mix of sorrow for the victims, anger at the perpetrators, and a long unresolved debate about the best way to prevent such tragedies while preserving civil liberties and international norms. Understanding the facts of 9/11, the planning, the people involved, the immediate human consequences, and the long shadow it cast, helps explain why Osama bin Laden's name became, for many, the shorthand for a new era of global conflict and counter-terrorism policy. This chapter of the biography must not be read to glorify or to simplify. It is a careful record of events and consequences. The attacks were committed by a small group acting on extremist ideology. They produced enormous harm, triggered high-stakes policy choices, and reshaped countless lives. The events of that morning, and the international reaction that followed, are central to any full understanding of Osama bin Laden's impact on the world. When the towers of the World Trade Center fell on September 11, 2001, and the Pentagon smoldered from the impact of another jetliner, Osama bin Laden became the most wanted man in the world. Within days, his name was on the lips of every world leader. His face appeared on the front page of newspapers across continents, and the United States government made it clear the hunt for bin Laden would not stop until he was captured or killed. The American response was swift. In October 2001, the United States and its allies launched a military campaign in Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban, who had given Osama safe haven. Bombs fell on Kandahar, Kabul, and Jalalabad, and coalition forces working with Afghan opposition fighters quickly forced the Taliban from power. Within weeks, al-Qaeda's training camps lay in ruins, and many of its members had been killed, captured, or scattered. Yet Osama bin Laden himself was not among them. In December 2001, US forces and Afghan allies cornered bin Laden and his followers in the mountains of Tora Bora near the Pakistani border. The caves of Tora Bora became the stage for what could have been the final chapter of his life. American bombers pounded the mountains, and Afghan militias fought on the ground. But despite the intensity of the assault, Osama escaped. Exactly how remains debated. Some accounts suggest he slipped across the border into Pakistan with the help of loyal guides, while others argue failures in US strategy allowed him to escape. Whatever the truth, by the end of 2001, Osama bin Laden had vanished. From 2002 onward, bin Laden lived as a fugitive. His years of hiding were marked by extreme secrecy, careful discipline, and constant movement. He avoided electronic communications that could be traced. He relied on trusted couriers to deliver messages, sometimes written by hand, other times recorded on video or audio cassettes. He changed locations when necessary, often hiding in Pakistan's remote tribal areas along the Afghan border, where local tribes had long resisted central government authority and where outsiders could disappear easily. But Osama did not simply vanish into the mountains and remain silent. From his hideouts, he continued to release messages to the world. Videos and audio recordings emerged periodically, in which he praised the 9/11 attackers, justified al-Qaeda's cause, condemned American foreign policy, and called for new recruits. These messages were carefully timed, sometimes appearing around US elections or major world events, showing that bin Laden was still attempting to shape global opinion. To his supporters, these messages kept the movement alive. To his enemies, they were taunts, reminders that the world's most powerful intelligence agencies had not yet captured him. During these years, al-Qaeda itself changed dramatically. The US invasion of Afghanistan had destroyed its central base of operations. No longer able to train thousands of recruits in open camps, the organization became more decentralized. New branches or affiliates emerged in different parts of the world. In Iraq, militants under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda, eventually forming what became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, was established. In North Africa, groups rebranded themselves as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. These affiliates carried out bombings, kidnappings, and insurgencies in their own regions, often inspired by bin Laden's vision but acting with considerable independence. This decentralization made al-Qaeda harder to eliminate. Even as the core leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan was hunted, its ideology spread across continents. Attacks inspired or directed by al-Qaeda affiliates struck in Bali, Madrid, London, and other cities. Some plots were foiled, others succeeded. To the United States and its allies, it was proof that al-Qaeda was not merely a single group of men in caves, but a global movement. Meanwhile, Osama's own life was marked by increasing isolation. Reports from captured al-Qaeda operatives, and later from documents recovered after his death, show that he lived under strict routines. He moved with some of his wives and children, but his world was limited to the compounds and safe houses where he hid. He exercised regularly, maintained a simple diet, and spent time reading and writing. He remained involved in al-Qaeda's strategy, sending letters to subordinates, offering guidance, and sometimes criticizing them for tactics he felt were counterproductive. For example, he was concerned about attacks that killed large numbers of Muslim civilians, fearing these would damage al-Qaeda's reputation among Muslims. Yet his influence over the wider network declined. Affiliates often acted on their own, pursuing local agendas that sometimes clashed with his vision. In Iraq, Zarqawi's brutal campaign of sectarian violence alarmed bin Laden, but he could do little to stop it. In Yemen and North Africa, militants carried out operations that drew harsh retaliation from governments, raising questions about whether al-Qaeda's strategy was helping or hurting Muslim communities. For the United States, the hunt for Osama bin Laden became a symbol of the war on terror. Presidents George W. Bush and later Barack Obama made his capture or death a priority. Billions of dollars were spent on intelligence, surveillance, and special operations aimed at finding him. Satellites scanned remote areas, spies infiltrated networks, and informants were recruited. For years, every lead seemed to dry up. Some believed he was hiding in caves along the Afghan-Pakistani border. Others speculated he was constantly on the move, slipping from one safe house to another. There were even rumors he might have died. The reality was more surprising. After years in the tribal areas, Osama eventually settled in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a garrison town not far from Islamabad, the capital. The compound was unusual. Tall walls topped with barbed wire, no telephone or internet lines, and residents who never allowed their garbage to be collected. For years, bin Laden lived there quietly with several of his wives, children, and grandchildren. He rarely left the compound, relying on trusted couriers to carry his messages. His world had shrunk dramatically from the days when he commanded fighters in Afghanistan or gave interviews to the press. Yet even in this isolation, he remained a figure of global significance. Al-Qaeda's attacks and threats continued to shape international security policy. His occasional recorded messages reminded the world he was still alive. For Americans, his evasion was a source of frustration and a constant reminder of unfinished business. For his followers, his survival was proof of divine protection and perseverance. By 2010, US intelligence agencies had identified a courier closely linked to bin Laden. Following this man eventually led them to the Abbottabad compound. Months of surveillance confirmed suspicions. The compound's size, its secrecy, and the behavior of its residents all pointed to the possibility that Osama bin Laden was inside. After nearly a decade of searching, the United States was closing in on its target. The years between 2002 and 2011 thus marked a transformation in Osama bin Laden's life. He went from being a visible leader, declaring war in public, to a hidden fugitive, living in secrecy and isolation. Al-Qaeda went from a centralized organization with training camps in Afghanistan to a decentralized global network with affiliates in multiple countries. The US went from shock and grief to relentless pursuit, reshaping its laws, its security practices, and its foreign policy in the process. By 2010, nearly a decade had passed since the attacks of September 11, 2001. The United States had invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, launched a global war on terror, and spent billions of dollars trying to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. Yet despite the most sophisticated intelligence gathering systems in the world, the man who had orchestrated 9/11 had eluded capture. To many Americans, his absence was a constant reminder of unfinished business. To Al-Qaeda's supporters, his survival was proof of resilience. To historians and analysts, the manhunt for Osama became one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations of modern times. The breakthrough came not from satellites, drones, or intercepted phone calls, but from a courier. US intelligence agencies had long known that bin Laden relied on couriers to communicate with the outside world. Since he avoided telephones and the internet, these couriers carried handwritten notes or memorized messages to Al-Qaeda operatives and back. By following one such courier, American intelligence finally found the clue they had been searching for. The man was known by the nickname Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, though his true identity was later revealed as Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed. He had been on US intelligence watch lists for years, believed to be one of bin Laden's most trusted messengers. When analysts traced his movements in Pakistan, they discovered something unusual. He regularly traveled to a large, mysterious compound in the city of Abbottabad, about 120 kilometers from Islamabad, Pakistan's capital. Abbottabad was not the kind of place most people imagined bin Laden hiding. It was not a remote cave in the tribal areas, nor a rugged mountain hideout. Abbottabad was a relatively quiet garrison town, home to military academies and a large population of soldiers and officers. It was also close to major roads and within reach of Pakistan's capital. The idea that the world's most wanted man might be living comfortably in a compound in such a place seemed almost unbelievable. Yet the compound itself raised suspicions immediately. Built in 2005, it stood out from its surroundings. It was far larger than neighbouring houses. with high walls up to 18 feet tall, topped with barbed wire. It had 2 security gates but no visible telephone lines or internet connections. The residents burned their trash instead of leaving it out for collection, an unusual practice in a town where neighbors lived ordinary, open lives. People rarely entered or left, and the compound's upper floors were hidden by privacy walls, shielding anyone inside from outside view. By late 2010, American intelligence analysts were convinced they had found something significant. Surveillance began in earnest. Satellites and drones monitored the compound. Local informants gathered information on its residents. Analysts studied the patterns of those who lived there. One figure in particular, referred to as the Pacer, caught their attention. He never left the compound. He appeared to be taller than the other men, and he seemed to exercise regularly by walking in circles within the walls. Could this be Osama Bin Laden himself? The evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling. By early 2011, the intelligence community presented its findings to President Barack Obama. The CIA estimated with varying degrees of confidence between 60 and 80% that Bin Laden was living in the Abbottabad compound. There was no photograph, no confirmed DNA, no intercepted phone call to prove it absolutely. But after nearly 10 years, this was the best lead they had ever had. The decision now rested with the president and his advisors. Several options were considered. One was to launch an airstrike, dropping bombs on the compound to kill everyone inside. This would be less risky for American personnel, but it would also destroy evidence and might kill civilians, including women and children who were known to live there. Another option was to wait, gathering more intelligence until certainty increased. But waiting carried the risk that Bin Laden might move again and disappear as he had before. The third option was the most daring, a special operations raid. Navy SEALs could be flown into the compound by helicopter, storm the building, capture or kill Bin Laden, and then extract. This option was the riskiest, but it offered the chance of confirmation and evidence. President Obama weighed the options with his national security team. The memories of 9/11 still hung heavy. Publicly, Obama had promised that if the United States had a lead on Bin Laden, it would act. Privately, he knew that a failed operation could damage America's credibility and his own presidency. After weeks of deliberation, Obama gave the order. The SEAL raid would go ahead. The mission was given the codename Operation Neptune Spear. Planning was meticulous. The Navy's elite SEAL Team 6, officially known as the U.S. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, was chosen to carry out the operation. A full-scale model of the Abbottabad compound was built on a training base, where the SEALs rehearsed repeatedly. They practiced entry points, room clearings, and contingencies. They knew the mission was dangerous. The compound was near Pakistan's military academy, and if Pakistani forces detected the raid, it could spark an armed confrontation. The SEALs were also told to expect resistance from Bin Laden's guards. On the night of May 1, 2011, May 2 in Pakistan, the operation began. 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters, specially equipped for stealth, carried the SEALs from Jalalabad, Afghanistan, across the border into Pakistan. The flight was tense. If Pakistani radar detected them, the mission could be compromised before it began, but the helicopters flew low to avoid detection. As the SEALs approached the compound, disaster nearly struck. One of the helicopters experienced a dangerous aerodynamic issue due to the high walls and heat inside the compound. It crash-landed within the courtyard. Miraculously, no one was killed, and the SEALs quickly adjusted their plan. The other helicopter landed outside, and the raid continued. Over the next 40 minutes, the SEALs systematically cleared the compound. They breached doors, swept rooms, and engaged in brief firefights with residents who resisted. Several of Bin Laden's guards were killed, as well as one of his adult sons. Women and children were moved aside, but kept under control. Finally, on the 3rd floor of the main building, the SEALs found Osama Bin Laden. He was unarmed but resisted, according to official accounts. A SEAL fired, striking him in the head and chest. The man who had eluded capture for a decade, who had been the architect of 9/11, lay dead in his bedroom. The SEALs quickly confirmed his identity using photographs and DNA samples. They gathered computers, documents, and digital drives, seizing what would later become known as the Abbottabad documents, a treasure trove of intelligence on Al-Qaeda's operations and Bin Laden's communications. Then, with Bin Laden's body, they boarded the surviving helicopter and flew back into Afghanistan. The crashed Black Hawk was destroyed with explosives to prevent its technology from falling into other hands. When President Obama addressed the world later that night, he announced, "Osama Bin Laden is dead." Crowds gathered outside the White House and in New York City, cheering, waving flags and chanting USA, USA. For many Americans, it was a moment of closure after a decade of war and loss. For the families of 9/11 victims, it was a long-awaited form of justice. Yet reactions around the world were more complex. In much of the West, the news was met with relief and triumph. In parts of the Muslim world, reactions were divided. Many ordinary Muslims condemned bin Laden and saw his death as the end of a man who had brought tragedy to their communities. Others, however, viewed him as a martyr, and his death became a rallying point for extremist propaganda. In Pakistan, the raid caused embarrassment and controversy. How could the world's most wanted man have lived for years in a compound just a short distance from the country's premier military academy without anyone noticing? The Pakistani government denied knowledge but faced widespread suspicion. Bin Laden's body was taken to Afghanistan for final confirmation and then flown to the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson in the Arabian Sea. There, in accordance with Islamic practice and to prevent his burial site from becoming a shrine, his body was washed, wrapped and buried at sea within 24 hours of his death. The Abbottabad raid ended the life of Osama bin Laden, but it did not end the story of Al-Qaeda or the debate over his legacy. The intelligence gathered in the compound showed that even in hiding he remained involved in guiding the network, reviewing plans, and offering advice. It also revealed his concerns about Al-Qaeda's image and the impact of killing Muslim civilians. But it was clear that by 2011 his influence had diminished compared to the 1990s. The raid itself became one of the most famous special operations missions in history. For the United States, it was proof of persistence, intelligence coordination, and military skill. For Pakistan, it was a moment of humiliation, raising questions about sovereignty and complicity. For the wider world, it was a dramatic conclusion to a decade-long manhunt. Osama bin Laden's death closed one chapter, but left many questions. Could his ideology survive without him? Would Al-Qaeda splinter or adapt? Would new groups rise to take its place? In the years that followed, the answers would prove complex. Al-Qaeda survived, though weakened. Other groups like ISIS would rise, inspired by similar ideas but often in conflict with Al-Qaeda itself. What is certain is that the night of May 1–2, 2011 marked the end of Osama bin Laden's life, the man who had become the face of global terrorism, the man who had reshaped international security, and the man whose choices had set the world on a path of wars and counter-wars that continue to this day. From one perspective, Osama bin Laden was the son of privilege, born into one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. He could have lived a life of luxury, managing businesses, enjoying wealth, and being part of the elite that thrived under oil prosperity. Instead, he chose another path. Influenced by teachers, wars, and ideologies, he dedicated his life to what he called jihad, framing himself as a defender of Islam against Western domination and corrupt Muslim rulers. This decision transformed him from a quiet university student into the world's most notorious militant leader. From another perspective, Osama was a symbol of defiance. To those who admired him, especially in radical circles, he represented courage against overwhelming odds. They saw him as the man who stood up to superpowers, first the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and then the United States after the Gulf War. His image was carefully constructed, tall, austere, dressed simply, speaking softly yet with conviction. This image, amplified through videos and speeches, became a rallying point for extremists who believed violence was the only way to resist. But from the perspective of his enemies and the majority of the world, Osama bin Laden was the face of terrorism. He was the architect of mass murder, responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people across continents. The embassy bombings in East Africa, the USS Cole attack, and above all the September 11 attacks marked him as a criminal on a scale rarely seen in modern times. To many, he was not a revolutionary or a religious leader, but a terrorist whose ideology brought destruction not only to Western targets, but also to countless Muslims who suffered under wars and reprisals triggered by Al-Qaeda's actions. His legacy is therefore complex. On one hand, he succeeded in what he set out to do. He forced the United States and its allies into wars that drained resources, cost lives, and reshaped geopolitics. He altered the global security landscape, changing how nations approach intelligence, border control, and counter-terrorism. He inspired a generation of militants, ensuring that even after his death, the struggle he began would continue in new forms. On the other hand, his vision of a united Islamic world under his interpretation of jihad failed to materialize. Instead of unity, divisions deepened. Many Muslims rejected his ideology, condemning his violence and insisting that Islam is a religion of peace. Instead of liberation, his actions brought destruction to Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and beyond. Instead of weakening America, his attacks initially gave the United States a clear purpose: rallying allies and reshaping international order. The death of Osama bin Laden was not the death of terrorism, nor even the death of Al-Qaeda. His organization survived, though weakened, and continued to operate through affiliates in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. More significantly, his ideas lived on. Some of his followers went on to form even more brutal groups, such as ISIS, whose rise in Iraq and Syria after 2013 shocked the world with its extreme violence and its brief creation of a self-proclaimed caliphate. In this sense, Osama's legacy is like a shadow, not a single structure but an inspiration, not a state but an idea, one that continues to echo in conflicts and ideologies across the globe. For historians, the life of Osama bin Laden raises larger questions. How does one man born into wealth choose to dedicate himself to violence? How did failures in politics, governance, and diplomacy create an environment in which his message resonated with thousands? Could his rise have been prevented if different choices had been made in the Middle East, in US foreign policy, in education, in global cooperation? And what lessons should future generations learn from the story of his life and death? In the end, Osama bin Laden's story is both unique and universal. Unique because he was at the center of events that shook the world, commanding an organization that carried out the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history. Universal because his story reflects the timeless truth that individuals can become symbols far larger than themselves. For good or for ill, his death in 2011 ended the life of a man, but it did not end the debates about justice, war, religion, and power that his name will forever evoke. And so his biography closes, but the questions remain. Was he a product of his time or the cause of a new era? Was his legacy one of defiance or destruction? Was he a revolutionary leader, a terrorist mastermind, or both? What is certain is that Osama bin Laden changed the world, and the world will never forget his name. This was the life of Osama bin Laden, from privileged beginnings in Saudi Arabia to the most wanted man in the world. His actions changed history, shaped wars, and left behind a legacy that still influences our present. But what do you think? Was he mainly a symbol of resistance, or only a bringer of destruction? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective.